Hello, Adventure Club kiddos. It's Miss Cordelia. I miss you all so much. Today, I'm going to be reading you a book about Abraham Lincoln. This book is called Abraham Lincoln for the People by Ann Culver. Chapter 1, Rolling Off a Log. Let's go down to the creek and see if there are any fish, young Abraham Lincoln said to his visiting friend. I wish we could go swimming, but we can't because it's Sunday. It was a hot afternoon in June. Young Abe was 7 years old. His friend Austin was 8. Austin's family had driven their horse and wagon over miles of rough Kentucky roads to visit Abe's family. It was a treat for the Lincolns to have company. In 1816, Kentucky was pioneer country. Families lived in log cabins they built themselves. There were no neighbors nearby. The two boys were restless, listening to the grown-ups talk and talk. They were glad to get away by themselves. We can go across the log bridge to the island, Abe said. I saw some partridges yesterday. The boys started across. Knob Creek was flooded by heavy rains. The logs were slippery under their feet. Splash! Young Abe fell in the water. Neither of the boys knew how to swim. The water was so deep it was over Abe's head, and the current was fast. Austin threw out a long stick. He held one end. Abe caught the other end. Abe gasped and spluttered. He nearly dragged his friend in. Finally, Austin pulled Abe up shore. Thank goodness you didn't drown, Austin said. He pounded Abe on the back to help him get his breath. The boys put their clothes on the rocks to dry. The sun stayed hot. Soon the boys could dress again. They pulled their trousers smooth and slicked down their hair. Young Abe grinned. Nobody would ever guess we had to swim, he said. His blue eyes twinkled. Austin looked suspicious. Abe Lincoln was the smartest boy in school. He had learned to read faster than anyone. Abe loved mischief. He was always thinking up new pranks. Once the teacher had said, Abe Lincoln, you must have 2 imps inside of you. One good imp and one bad imp. Abe, did you roll off that log on purpose? Austin asked. Abe's blue eyes grew sober. You know I wouldn't do that, he said. We'd get punished for swimming on Sunday. I know, Austin nodded uncomfortably. We'd better promise not to tell. Abe looked at his friend. Promising isn't enough, Abe said. We've got to swear. Put your right hand up. Swear by the sun and the moon and dog star that we'll never tell a soul, Abe said. He was as solemn as a judge. Austin shivered. Oh, I swear, he said quickly. Abe's friend kept his word. He never told the secret until many years later. He did not tell until after Abe Lincoln had grown up to be a great president and had been killed. Abe and I promised we wouldn't tell, Austin said then. When Abe Lincoln made a promise, he kept it. Chapter 2, Firelight. Who can spell Mississippi? The teacher pointed his ruler at the class. Abe Lincoln's long arms shot up. Mississippi, he said, all in one breath. Abe was bright in school. He was always the last one standing in a spell down. But there were few school days for pioneer children. They had to work as hard as their fathers and mothers. In good weather, they were needed for chores in the fields, so they stayed home. On winter mornings, it was sometimes too snowy for the children to walk to school. The prairie winds blew cold. To help keep warm, each child held a potato. It had been roasted in the coal fire. The children held the potatoes in their mittened hands on the long walk. They ate the potatoes with their lunch. On the walk home, their fingers and toes were often frost-nipped. Sometimes there were not enough families among the pioneer settlers to have a school. Other times, there was no teacher in the lonely country. Abe Lincoln had one sister, Sarah. She was 2 years older than Abe. They went to school like other pioneer children, here and there, now and then. But Abe learned to read. He read even at home, beginning with the Bible. Then he walked miles to find other books. He would knock on a farmhouse door. "Please, have you any book I could borrow?" Abe would ask. "I'll be careful of it and be sure to bring it back." Abe borrowed Aesop's Fables, Pilgrim's Progress, A Life of George Washington, and A Farmer's Almanac. He read every word carefully, lying in front of the fire for light. He also learned to write and to do arithmetic. A charred stick was Abe's pencil. He spelled out words on the wooden fire shovel. He figured sums in arithmetic. Abe Lincoln's father was a carpenter. Their furniture was homemade. There were tables and benches and a feather bed. Families could be happy even with few comforts. The Lincoln house was a happy one. Like most pioneers, the Lincolns moved often. They would hear of a place where there was better land. Then they would load the family furniture into a wagon. They tied the cow behind the wagon and moved on to a new home. Young Abe never minded moving. He knew his father would build another log cabin. There would be another creek to fish and new friends to meet. Abe was always quick to make friends. Sometimes the new friends thought young Abe was lazy. He would chop a tree or plow a field or build a fence as fast as any boy. But they thought Abe spent too much time reading. They thought that made him different. When Abe was 10 years old, his family moved to Indiana. Later that year, something happened that made Abe really different. His mother, pretty, gentle Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died. Then life was very lonely for young Abe and his sister. There was no fire to come to at night. There was only a cold, bare cabin with a dirt floor. Their mother's spinning wheel stood idle. There was no one to weave the cloth. Abe's long arms and legs grew out of his jackets and trousers. His sister Sarah's skirts climbed above her knees. There was no one to make new clothes for the children or mend the old ones. Chapter 3. Footprints. One happy day, Abe's father brought home a new wife, Sarah Bush Lincoln. Abe and his sister liked their cheerful, kind stepmother. She brought 3 children of her own, John, Sarah, and Matilda, to be stepbrother and stepsisters to Abe and Sarah. Now the house was lively again, with 5 children in it. Sarah Lincoln was a busy mother. She kept the house clean and a kettle of hot food cooking. She listened to the children talk and laughed at their fun. One day, Abe played a joke. The ceiling had just been whitewashed. Dennis Hanks, Abe's older cousin, loved mischief as much as Abe did. Abe got Dennis to boost him upside down on his shoulders. Then Abe reached up and made footprints across the clean white ceiling. Abe was sure his stepmother would be puzzled. She would wonder who could have walked on the ceiling. Abe's stepmother took one look at the footprints. Nobody but Abe Lincoln would ever thought up such a thing, she said. Even though the ceiling was spoiled, she laughed. Abe cheerfully helped his stepmother clean up. Later, he wrote in his copybook, "Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen, will be good, but God knows when." Life was busy for young Abe. His new mother helped him get over his loneliness. He was glad to be a part of a family again. Still, Abe never forgot what it had felt like to be lonely and unhappy. All his life, it made him understand other people who were also unhappy. Abe could remember the nights he had listened to the prairie wind blow sadly. He remembered wondering whether he would ever stop feeling lonesome. When Abe grew older, he worked harder. He helped his father to farm. He milked cows and chopped down trees. Some of the other farmers hired Abe to work for them. Abe's favorite chore was taking grain to the mill. He had to wait for his turn to have the grain ground into flour. He had plenty of time to listen to the men talk and swap stories. Abe loved to swap stories. No matter how much he worked, Abe always found time to read. Abe's father was impatient. "The boy is wasting his time with books," he said. Abe's mother had understood why Abe wanted to read. His stepmother understood too. "Let him read," she said. "Abe takes his time learning things, but he learns them right. Someday, he'll know everything in those books. Just wait and see." All his life, Abraham Lincoln remembered his own mother, but he never forgot his stepmother's kindness and patience. When he had been elected president, he went back to visit his stepmother before he went to Washington. Chapter 4. Indian War. When Abe Lincoln was a young man, he left his family and went to earn a living in New Salem, Illinois. Abe had grown very tall. He was as lanky as ever with broad shoulders and long legs. Abe seldom bothered to dress up much, but there was a nice look about Abe Lincoln in spite of his careless clothes. His landlady said, "Abe doesn't always look exactly like a fine gentleman, but he acts like one." New Salem was a little town. It had only 100 people. Still, it was more lively than living in a cabin in a lonely prairie. Abe liked having neighbors nearby. He was as quick as always to make friends. Everybody liked Abe, though sometimes they felt he was a little different. In spite of his fun, he seemed serious. He thought about many things outside of the little town. He wondered about the world and life and what was right and what was wrong. Sometimes Abe's friends were puzzled, but they admired him. "Abe Lincoln is sure to be a success," they said, "but first he'll have to make up his mind what to be a success at." It was true that Abe had a hard time deciding what kind of work he wanted to do. He worked as a farmer and a carpenter. Then he worked in a sawmill and on the riverboats. He also worked in politics now and then. Abe was always looking for other work to try. When there was a war with the Indians, Abe stopped worrying about what job he should choose. He had to go with the other men to fight. In pioneer days, there were many fights between the Indians and the settlers. Both sides did unfair things in battle. Chief Black Hawk was on the warpath. He burned down the settlers' houses and left many bloody scalps. New Salem sent a volunteer company to fight the Indians. Abe Lincoln was in the company. There were no real officers. When the company voted for a captain, they elected Abraham Lincoln. Abe was pleased with the honor. He was glad the other men liked him. One day, an Indian came into Lincoln's camp. The Indian was helpless and unarmed. He had a safe conduct pass. The pass meant the Indian could go through the battle line without being attacked or hurt. Some of the men in Lincoln's company were restless. They felt homesick and mean. "We were sent to kill the Indians," they said. "Here's an Indian. Let's kill him." Abe Lincoln knew his men might be angry. They might not want him to be their captain anymore, but he took the chance. The Indian went free. The men saw that Abe had been honest enough to take the chance of not being liked. They liked Abe all the more. Abe Lincoln went on being captain. Chapter 5, The Barrel. When the Indian War was over, Abe went back to work. He kept a store. At the same time, he was postmaster of New Salem. He worked as a surveyor also. A surveyor measures land for people. Keeping store was the job that suited Abe best so far. There weren't many customers in the little town. When the store was empty, Abe had time to read his books. In summer, he read outdoors under a tree. When the weather was bad, he stretched his long legs on the store counter and went on reading. Still, Abe was not satisfied. He didn't want to be a storekeeper all his life. "If only I could find some work where reading books is important," Abe thought. One day, a farmer drove up to Lincoln's store. The farmer had his wife and children and his furniture packed on a wagon. "We're crowded," the farmer said to Abe Lincoln. "I've got to leave something behind. Will you take this barrel? Pay me $50 and you can keep it." Abe gave the farmer $50. When he unpacked the barrel, Abe found something that changed his whole life. At the bottom, under some old shoes, he found a thick book. It was a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, the most important law book ever printed. That night, Abe Lincoln began to read Blackstone. Abe remembered a Major Stewart he had met in the Indian War. "If you ever want to be a lawyer," Major Stewart had told Abe, "come and see me. I need a partner." A lawyer was a man who understood laws and helped people who were in trouble. A lawyer could help them tell their story in court. In court, a judge decided what was right and fair. A lawyer could help a person be treated fairly. Abe Lincoln had always liked to see people get what was fair. He decided to try to be a lawyer. It took Abe many long months to study the Blackstone. He wrote to Major Stewart that he had started to study law. Major Stewart sent him more books to read. In those days, most young lawyers did not go to law school. They read and studied law by themselves and were helped by an older lawyer. Major Stewart helped Abe. Abe went on working while he studied. His store failed and Abe had lots of debt he could not pay. He was more determined than ever to be a lawyer. Then he could earn money and pay his debts. At last, the day came when Abe passed his examinations. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer. He went to Springfield, Illinois. Major Stewart kept his promise. He took Abe into his law office. Mr. Stewart introduced his young partner to his family. One of John Stewart's cousins was a young lady named Mary Todd. Mary had light brown curls and blue eyes. She had grown up in Kentucky. Now she lived with her married sister in Springfield. Mary Todd was very popular. She had lots of beaux who could bow politely and dance gracefully. Abe Lincoln was too awkward to bow politely. His feet were too big to dance properly. With a twinkle in her eye, Mary told her sister, "Mr. Lincoln said he wants to dance with me in the worst way, and he certainly did." But Mary liked Abe Lincoln best of all the men she knew. Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married in her sister's parlor. Chapter 6. Horses, Pigs, and People. Now Abe Lincoln was a lawyer and a married man. It was time to settle down. The first Lincoln baby was a boy. He was named Robert Todd Lincoln for Mary's father. After Robert was born, the Lincolns bought a house. Mary Lincoln was very busy at home. When little Eddie was born, there were 2 babies to take care of. Mary mended, baked, and kept the house tidy. She made her husband white linen shirts herself. Abe Lincoln worked hard in his law office. He took good care of his family. He paid back his debts from the store in New Salem. After that, Abe Lincoln was never in debt again. Hard work did not make Abe Lincoln forget how to get along with people. He had as many friends as ever. He never forgot to be gentle. Once, on his way to court, Abe Lincoln saw a man beating a horse. Abe dropped his law papers and ran to take the man's hand. When the man promised to stop whipping the poor horse, Abe Lincoln picked up his lawyer papers and went on into the courthouse. Abe Lincoln never liked to see a person or an animal treated cruelly. Another day, he was riding far out in the country. He saw a pig stuck under a fence. Abe Lincoln stopped his horse and got out of the buggy. He had to pry up a heavy fence to get the pig loose. Finally, the pig ran free, squealing happily. The lawyer who was riding with Abe Lincoln was impatient. "Why do you bother about a pig?" the lawyer asked. Abe Lincoln shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "Only I don't like to see anything not free." Abe Lincoln still loved to tell stories. Once, a judge was angry because Lincoln was whispering to a friend in court. The friend laughed out loud. The judge made Abe pay a fine of $5. Afterward, the judge asked Abe Lincoln, "What was that story you told?" Abe told the story again. The judge laughed too. He gave Abe Lincoln back his $5. Abe Lincoln was a good lawyer. He won many cases in court. He could speak well to defend his side. People in Springfield began to say, "If you want a lawyer, get Abe Lincoln. He's smart and he's honest." Lincoln's law office was a busy place, but Abe Lincoln spent plenty of time with his family. He loved to play with the children. Little Eddie Lincoln had died. But besides Robert, the Lincolns had 2 younger sons. Willie and Tad loved mischief as much as their father. They would wait for their father to walk home from his office. Other neighborhood children waited too. Abe Lincoln was very tall. When he wore his high black stovepipe hat, the children could see him coming along a block away. They would run to meet him with shouts. The first one to reach Abe Lincoln got a ride home on his shoulders. One morning, Abe Lincoln walked past a neighbor's yard. He saw an 8-year-old Josephine Remen standing at the gate. She wore her best coat and bonnet, but she was crying bitterly. Abe Lincoln stopped. "Whatever is the matter, Josephine?" he asked. Josephine sobbed harder. "I'm going on the steam cars to visit in Decatur." It's my first trip on the train alone, but the wagon didn't call for my trunk. It's too big for Mama to carry, and my papa isn't home, so I can't go. Abe Lincoln swung the trunk on his shoulder and took the little girl by the hand. Come along, Josephine, he said. I'll take your trunk to the station. I'm as good as a wagon any day. Chapter 7. The Union Must Be Saved. More and more people began to know Abraham Lincoln. They respected his work as a lawyer and as a speaker. Abe had always liked politics. Now he began to be important in politics too. He was elected to the United States Congress. He went to Washington. When Abe Lincoln's term in Congress was finished, he came back to Springfield and worked in his law office. He went on working in politics too. He made many speeches. People who heard him said, Abe Lincoln will be a great man someday. Abraham Lincoln had decided about a very important question. It was the question of slavery. Half of the states in America were saying, slavery is wrong. One person should not buy another person and own him. The other states said, we must decide what is right for ourselves. If we cannot, then we will leave the Union. Abe Lincoln was a very fair man. He wanted everyone to have a fair chance. Years ago, Abe had been fair to the Indian when the men in his company wanted to kill him. Abraham Lincoln thought a long time about the question of slavery. Abe Lincoln made up his mind. I must go against slavery. He said, he made an important speech. I do not believe a country can be half slave and half free, he said. Abraham Lincoln believed all the states in the country must stay together. The Union must be saved. He made many more speeches. He argued with other men in politics. Many people thought Lincoln's speeches were right, and others thought he was wrong. When Abe Lincoln came home from making a speech, Mrs. Lincoln and the boys hugged him. Whether I'm right or wrong, Abe said, my family still seems glad to see me. In 1860, enough people believed Abraham Lincoln was right to nominate him for the President of the United States. His family and friends and neighbors all hoped he would be elected. The weeks before the election were exciting. Important men came to call at the Lincoln House. There were judges and senators and governors. There were newspaper reporters as well. Willie and Tad were used to seeing important men. They ran in and out of the parlor no matter what dignified gentlemen were calling on their father. When election day came, people all over the country voted for the next president. The news came that Abraham Lincoln had been elected. That night, there was a torchlight parade in Springfield. Everyone in town marched to the Lincoln House carrying lighted torches. The oldest Lincoln boy, Robert, was away at college, but Tad and Willie stayed up all night long past their bedtime to watch the parade. Mrs. Lincoln and her sisters worked to give all the visitors something to eat. They had to borrow more coffee and cookies from all the neighbors. Willie and Tad sat on the gateposts of the Lincoln House. Do you want to see old Abe? They asked visitors. Give us a nickel and we'll show him to you. Chapter 8. The White House. When it was time to leave for Washington, Willie and Tad were sad. It was exciting to have their father elected president, but the boys did not want to leave their home. The boys begged to take their dog, Fido, with them. Fido belonged half to Willie and Tad and half to the Roll Boys, who were their best friends. How can we take half of Fido to Washington? Abe Lincoln asked. We don't know which half of Fido is ours. To comfort the boys, he promised they could have a pony in Washington. The Lincolns moved to the White House in 1861. Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States. Mr. Lincoln's family soon found out that their president had to work hard all day long. There were always crowds of people at his office door. Mr. Lincoln tried to see them all. He thought everyone had a right to talk to the president. It was often late at night before Mr. Lincoln could leave his office. But busy as he was, he kept his promise to Willie and Tad. He got them a pony. Even with a pony to play with, the boys were restless. They were very lonely for their friends back home. Their mother was lonely too. Many times they all wanted to be back in Springfield, where Mr. Lincoln had more time to be with his family. When the Civil War began, the president was even busier. He still played with the boys when he could or took Mrs. Lincoln for a drive, but night after night the light burned in the president's office. He talked with the generals of the Northern Army. Abraham Lincoln had to take many decisions alone. The North believes slavery is wrong, Mr. Lincoln said. The Southern states want to break away and govern themselves. The people on both sides believe they are right. The soldiers on both sides are fighting bravely. President Lincoln walked back and forth in his office, waiting for the terrible news of battle losses. One day, Willie and Tad waited to see their father. They waited impatiently outside his office. When the door was opened, the boys slipped in. They played around their father's desk all morning. The president went on with his work. He wasn't disturbed by the boys playing. Later, the president had a cabinet meeting. The most important men in the country sat at the table. Tad and Willie hid under the table and played around the men's feet. The important men were angry. They didn't think children should be allowed to disturb older people. Mr. Lincoln's secretary offered to shut the boys out of the room. No, Mr. Lincoln said. All over the country, boys are dying. Let the boys have fun when they can. Don't shut them out. Chapter 9, Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the worst battles of the war. It went on for several days. Mr. Lincoln waited up late for the reports. A long time after Tad had fallen asleep, Mrs. Lincoln came down to the president's office. "Come and rest," she begged her husband. "You can't help the poor boys who are fighting." "No," Mr. Lincoln shook his head sadly. "At least I can stay awake thinking about them. Our best young men are dying in both the North and the South." Abraham Lincoln never felt that the Southern people were enemies. He believed that war was the enemy. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Mr. Lincoln went to dedicate a cemetery there. His heart was heavy. "How can I make a speech?" he asked Mrs. Lincoln. "No words are as important as what the soldiers did at Gettysburg." On the train going to Gettysburg, Mr. Lincoln wrote down a few lines for his speech. The next day, the president read these lines. "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." The president's speech ended with the beautiful words, "That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Today, almost 100 years later, Abraham Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg is known all over the world. One winter during the war, Willie Lincoln was very sick. His fever got worse. The president and Mrs. Lincoln left an important party at the White House. They sat by Willie's bed. Willie asked to see his pony. The president had the pony led under the window. That cheered the sick boy a little. But Willie died. It was the saddest loss Abraham Lincoln and his wife ever felt. Tad missed his brother. "All over the country, families have lost their sons," Mr. Lincoln said. "Now we have lost ours. We must try to be as brave as the other families have been." When spring came, Robert Lincoln came home from college on vacation. The Lincolns were glad to see him. They tried to be cheerful for Robert's sake. Mr. Lincoln read that 2 nanny goats were for sale. "They'll make fine new pets for Tad," he said. He bought them so his son would not feel so lonely. The whole family laughed to see the saucy goats harnessed to a little red wagon. Tad drove them. He raced the goats up and down the White House driveway. They nearly upset General Grant when he came to call on the president. Sometimes Tad took the goats into the White House with him. Later, when Tad and his mother were away on a trip, Mr. Lincoln found one of the goats sleeping on Tad's bed. The goat had chewed the spread. Mr. Lincoln chased the goat back to the barn. When the busy president sent a telegram to Mrs. Lincoln, he took the time to add, "Tell Tad the goats are well." Chapter 10, Sunset. The Civil War lasted 4 years. It ended in 1865. President Lincoln signed the order that made the slaves in the South free. Soon, there would be no more slavery in America. All the states were united again. The Union was saved, but the damages of war had to be mended. The country must be led back to peace. Abraham Lincoln was elected president for a second term. "The hardest work is over," Mr. Lincoln told his wife. "Now we can be a family again." He smiled, but he looked old. His face was lined with worry. One evening, Mrs. Lincoln wanted to cheer up the president. She asked him to take her to the theater. The president and Mrs. Lincoln sat in a box. Halfway through the play, a shot was fired. President Lincoln was killed. An actor named John Wilkes Booth had shot the president. Booth was a queer, half-crazy person who had been upset by the war. People all over the country, North and South, were shocked by the terrible news. Now, Mrs. Lincoln had lost her husband. Robert and Tad had lost their father. The whole country had lost its great leader, Abraham Lincoln. The train that carried President Lincoln back home to Springfield was draped in black. Crowds of people stood by the railroad tracks in every city and town. Some waited all night on lonesome country roads to see the train go by. Many of the people wept. The train moved slowly. Its mournful whistle blew across the prairie where young Abraham Lincoln had lived. Abraham Lincoln was buried in Springfield, Illinois, where he lived the happiest years with his family. The Lincoln's house still stands there. The rooms are just as Lincoln left them. In Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial makes Americans remember their great president. There is a beautiful statue of Lincoln. His face looks down on the thousands of people who come there. It makes each one feel the deep kindness and understanding that Abraham Lincoln showed to all the people while he lived. Thank you for reading along with me, everyone. I miss you all so much. Have a great week.